My name is Trinity Holmes. I was a librarian once. Now I open the files no one else dares to touch. This is Trinity Holmes, P.I., a podcast of haunted histories and forgotten crimes. Every week we exhume the buried, unraveling the stories that slipped through the cracks. Cases that blur the line between truth and folklore, justice and silence, memory and myth. I come from a long line of detectives. My great-grandfather was Balthazar Holmes, youngest brother of Sherlock and Mycroft. He taught me one thing: no file ever stays closed forever. So light a candle, keep the tape rolling, and listen closely. Because some case files don't just haunt the past. They come looking for you. Ashwood Home for Orphans. Built at the turn of the century, meant to hold the unwanted, the unlucky, the inconvenient children of the county. It was 3 stories high, a square, respectable structure with a chapel at one end and a line of iron bedsteads filling the dormitories. By the 1930s, it was already bursting at the seams. 60, maybe 80 children crowding its halls, laughter and weeping echoing off plaster, tiny shoes scuffing down stairwells. And then one night in 1936, the fire came. Officially, it started in the laundry room, faulty wiring sparking against damp boards. Flames ate upwards, consuming timbers as if guided by a hunger. Within minutes, the entire home was a furnace. The county's report says 6 children perished, along with a caretaker who tried to reach them. 6 little coffins carried out beneath the gaze of reporters and grieving neighbors. 6 names printed neatly on paper, signed and sealed with the coroner's approval. 6. But the people who were there tell a different story. Volunteers swore they carried out more than 6 small bodies, though fewer were ever buried. Parents who came to claim their children found no answers, only locked doors at the county office. Neighbors remember the sound of screams, dozens, maybe more, the voices overlapping like a choir. And the children who survived, they whispered about friends who had vanished. Dormitory beds left strangely absent from the roll call. A boy named Samuel, who loved to draw, but whose name appeared on no official list. A girl with braids, who was never mentioned again. 6, said the papers, but the people of Ashwood murmured otherwise. And then the years passed. The orphanage was never rebuilt. Its ruins were left to rot. Bricks fell into weeds. Trees grew up where the chapel once stood. Official records were sealed. Adoption ledgers scorched and warped until numbers no longer matched. That's when the stories began. Foster families and adoptive parents, decades later, spoke of something uncanny in their homes. A child who was never adopted but still appeared in photographs, blurred and pale, standing at the edge of the frame. Mothers who swore they tucked in one child at night, but found 2 beds mussed in the morning. Neighbors insisting they saw children playing in the yard, though only one was officially there. Sometimes these extra children spoke. Their words were simple, aching, and strange. Where is matron? Where are the others? They never stayed long. A glimpse in a mirror, a tug at the bedsheet, the sound of light feet scurrying down the hall, and then nothing, just smoke in the air and the lingering chill of absence. I've stood on that ground. Today, Ashwood is little more than a scar in the earth, its foundation crumbling, half swallowed by vines. Blackened bricks jut upward like broken teeth. The wind cuts strangely through the trees, carrying echoes of what once was. Step close enough, and people say you'll hear them, the children, running down halls that no longer exist, their laughter rising and falling like breath. Sometimes they call out names. Sometimes they only watch. The county still insists. 6. The families, the survivors, the photographs, the voices on tape, they suggest something else. Something hungry, uncounted, wandering still. And so we open this case file. The story of children burned away by fire, erased by ink, but too stubborn to stay gone. The story of how memory, when denied, claws its way back into the present. Because if only 6 died, as the records claim, why do so many more still come back? Historical context. Ashwood Home for Children. To understand what happened the night Ashwood burned, you first have to know what the place was meant to be. Because an orphanage is supposed to be a refuge, a halfway house between abandonment and belonging. That was the promise. Ashwood never quite lived up to it. Origin of the orphanage. The Ashwood Home for Children was built in 1904, a proud county project, though the money and bricks came from a tangled marriage between public funds and church charity. The idea was simple, a place to house children who had nowhere else to go, those whose parents were dead, missing, or too poor to feed them. The building itself was a statement of Victorian confidence. 3 stories of brick, trimmed with white painted gables, its chimneys rising against the Alabama sky. Inside, long dormitories stretched wall to wall with iron bedsteads. There was a kitchen in the basement, a dining hall that could seat 100, and a chapel crowned with a wooden crucifix. The crucifix was meant to bring comfort, though some said its eyes were carved too deep, its gaze too knowing. At its founding, Ashwood could hold 40 children comfortably. By the 1930s, with the Great Depression biting down on every household, that number had swollen far beyond capacity. The weight of the Depression. It's important to picture the world outside Ashwood's red brick walls. Families broken by unemployment, parents unable to keep bread on the table, fathers disappearing in search of work, sometimes never returning, mothers quietly signing papers to surrender their children, hoping they might at least eat within Ashwood's dining hall. By 1935, records suggest that between 60 and 80 children were housed in the building at any given time. That number shifted like the tide. Some children came in for weeks, some stayed for years, and some never left at all. Overcrowding was a constant. Beds lined hallways. The smell of too many bodies clung to every corner. The ratio of children to caregivers was laughable. 10 to 1, sometimes worse. The staff, never more than a dozen, worked themselves thin, though not all of them were saints. Funding was erratic. Ashwood lived on county scraps, church donations, and the occasional parcel of cast-off food from sympathetic shopkeepers. Potatoes sprouting eyes, bread gone hard at the edges, meat of questionable origin. The children of Ashwood were often described in county reports as malnourished but manageable, which is another way of saying they were pale, thin, and hungry. Always hungry. The matron. At the center of the home was its matron, Agnes Harlow. Tall, rigid, with her hair drawn back in a knot so severe it seemed to pull the corners of her face with it. Agnes was the law of Ashwood. In photographs, her mouth is a straight, unforgiving line. Her eyes seem to look past the camera, as though fixed on something only she can see. To some, she was a stern but necessary presence. Order was required in a house full of orphans. After all, to others she was a tyrant. County papers from the 1920s list repeated complaints. Children disciplined too harshly, neglect bordering on cruelty. Former staff wrote of nights when Agnes would lock the dormitories from the outside, leaving crying children to comfort themselves until morning. Parents who adopted from Ashwood often noted that their children seemed underfed and undersized. One foster father wrote in a letter that his boy, only 7, ate like a creature starved half to death. Still, Agnes Harlow remained in charge. The county backed her. The church defended her. And her children, who had no one else, had little choice but to obey her. The house that never rested. Even before the fire, locals said the building felt wrong. It wasn't just the misery inside. The misery has a way of soaking into walls. It was something stranger, less easily explained. Visitors often reported unexplained drafts, cold air rushing down hallways with no open windows, doors slammed in empty rooms. Caretakers confessed they sometimes heard lullabies being sung, soft and tuneless, when no nurse was present. One volunteer recalled carrying laundry through the halls late one evening and hearing the distinct sound of children giggling in the stairwell. When she looked, there was no one there. She swore the laughter trailed after her all the way back to the dormitory. Ashwood had a reputation for shadows, too. Not the ordinary shadows of dusk, but elongated shapes that didn't quite match the children who cast them. A girl would walk past, her shadow lagging behind like a sulking sibling. A boy would turn a corner, but his silhouette would remain fixed against the wall a moment longer before vanishing. It is tempting, of course, to dismiss these tales as the product of overwork, stress, or imagination. But when enough people tell the same story in different words across decades, well, even the skeptics learn to listen. A place of unquiet childhoods. So this was Ashwood, a red brick orphanage that became a catch basin for the county's grief. A place stuffed beyond its seams with children who had nowhere else to go. A place run by a woman whose gaze could curdle milk, whose discipline left bruises deeper than the flesh. And some said a place where the veil between the living and the forgotten had always been thin. The orphans themselves whispered about it in the dormitories at night, about the sound of footsteps pacing between beds when everyone was accounted for, about lullabies crooned by unseen mouths, about cold hands brushing their hair back as they fell asleep. Small things, subtle things, easy to ignore, easy to file under childhood fears. But those small things built the foundation for something larger. When the fire came in 1936, it did not arrive in a vacuum. It came to a house already restless, a house already filled with shadows and hunger. Ashwood was never just an orphanage. It was a crucible, a place where loneliness multiplied, where whispers never stopped, where even the walls seemed to keep secrets. When the fire swept through, it was not simply burning wood and plaster. It was consuming decades of silence, cruelty, and neglect. And perhaps in the process, it gave voice to something that had been waiting all along. The fire of 1936. November 14th, 1936. It was a cold, bitter evening, the kind where the sky hangs heavy and low, and smoke from chimneys seems to cling in place rather than drift away. At Ashwood Home for Children, bedtime had just begun. Children shuffled into dormitories, whispering beneath their blankets. The chapel had gone quiet. its crucifix looming in the candlelight. Caretakers moved through the halls, making rounds. No one knew that within the hour, Ashwood would be gone. Chronology of the night. The official report, signed and sealed by the county, tells a simple story. The fire began in the basement laundry room, sparked by faulty wiring that had been neglected for too long. Sparks leapt from a frayed line, ignited lint, and found fuel in the wooden beams overhead. By the time anyone noticed, flames were crawling the walls like ivy. But eyewitnesses say the fire did not spread naturally. Within minutes, the blaze raced upward, filling the ground floor with choking smoke. The timbers, already dry and splintering from years of overuse, went up like kindling. Fire seared through stairwells, cutting off escape routes, swallowing doors in orange heat. Children who had gone to sleep moments before woke up coughing in darkness, their small lungs filling with ash. Some said the fire moved with intent, climbing faster than any natural blaze, as if something was urging it on. Eyewitness reports. Survivors speak of smoke rolling up stairwells like a living animal, curling and twisting, finding its way into every room. One girl, who would later be adopted and live to old age, recalled seeing faces in the smoke, blurred gray, watching her as she scrambled down the hallway. She swore the smoke whispered her name, pulling at her as she fled. A volunteer fireman, among the first on the scene, told his wife he heard screaming from more rooms than Ashwood even had. It was like the walls themselves were screaming, he said. The man never returned to fire service. Children carried out that night remembered the sounds of footsteps racing alongside them in the halls, though when they looked, no one was there. The official death toll. By morning, the flames had been beaten back. The building, once 3 proud stories, was nothing but smoldering ruin. The smell of wet ash clung to the town for days. The county coroner filled the paperwork quickly. 6 children dead, along with 1 caretaker who had tried to save them. Their names were printed in the local paper. Their coffins were buried with solemn ceremony. 6. The number was repeated in every report, every archive. 6 was the number that entered history. And 6 was the number the county would insist upon, even when confronted with evidence that suggested otherwise. The whispered discrepancy. The families of Ashwood's children never agreed with the official story. Some came to collect their children after the fire and were told simply, "There's no record of them here." Names they had signed into ledgers vanished. Birth certificates were missing. A few days after the fire, a local newspaper printed a small follow-up. Parents question official toll. In it, a reporter hinted that more children might have perished than the coroner admitted. The article disappeared after a single printing. No copies survive in county archives. And then came the rumors. Workers swore the orchard behind Ashwood had been disturbed in the days following the fire, that wagons left the ruins under cover of night, bound for that stretch of trees. Some whispered about shallow graves dug among the roots, hurried burials with no markers, no ceremony. Officially, nothing was ever found, but unofficially, the orchard grew quiet after that. Even in summer, birds avoided its branches. Paranormal details. The recovery of the bodies left behind its own unease. Men who carried the dead from the ruins described finding smaller, charred hands than they remembered. Corpses that seemed too numerous for the number declared. "I swear we brought out more than 6, one volunteer said. "I swear to God it was more." And yet the paperwork never reflected it. No additional names were recorded. The bodies vanished into a silence that felt deliberate. One fireman told his wife he had seen a row of children laid out on the ground, covered in sheets, but when he returned from hauling water, only half remained. The others, he said, had simply gone. His account was dismissed as exhaustion. Others said they saw children standing among the ruins, who were not burned, not coughing, not alive. One caretaker swore she saw a boy she knew had died in the dormitory, walking calmly out of the smoke, face pale and blank. When she reached for him, her hands passed through ash. The county's silence. The fire at Ashwood was declared a tragedy, but not a scandal. The coroner's number was repeated until it hardened into fact. 6 children, 1 caretaker, buried and forgotten. The orphanage was written off as an unfortunate loss. 1 more building claimed by poor wiring and bad luck. But the community whispered. Families knew more children had been lost. The survivors knew it. The firemen knew it. And the children, those who were never named, never mourned, seemed to know it too. The shadow left behind. Every fire leaves a scar, but Ashwood's scar spread further than its foundation. In the weeks that followed, townfolk said they could hear crying near the ruins, even when the ashes had cooled. At night, small shapes darted through the orchard, vanishing when pursued. Children who passed by swore they heard laughter behind them, though no one stood there. Ashwood was gone, but it was not empty. The silence left behind was too full, too heavy. The county wanted to close the file with 6 names, neat and tidy. But history is rarely so clean. The fire of 1936 devoured wood, plaster, and flesh, but it also fed on something deeper. It left behind more than ruins. It left behind a question that still lingers, almost 90 years later. If only 6 children died, why did so many more still cry out in the smoke? Aftermath and disappearance of records. When the flames of Ashwood were finally doused, the town expected the county to rebuild. After all, orphans don't vanish when buildings burn. They still needed beds to sleep in, bread to eat, some semblance of belonging. But no new Ashwood ever rose from the ruins. The rebuild that never happened. For a few months, officials spoke in vague promises. There were murmurs of relocating the children to a temporary hall, whispers of rebuilding the homes on sturdier ground, talk of modern wiring and safer exits. None of it came to pass. By the following spring, the land was sold off at auction. The red brick foundation was left to crack and sink into the earth. Vines crept in, swallowing windows, weaving green nets over the stone. Rain carried soot into the soil until the ground itself seemed stained. The children who had survived were scattered across hastily arranged foster homes, shipped to distant relatives, or absorbed into county programs that quickly lost track of them. The Ashwood survivors dissolved into the system like sugar into water, present but unseen, and perhaps most telling, the county sealed the adoption ledgers and case files. They vanished into archives, locked away with a neat, bureaucratic bow. Requests for information were denied. When pressed, officials replied with the same phrase, "For the privacy of the children." Ledger oddities. The ledgers themselves, what remains of them, tell a different story. In the county archives, there are 2 scorched books, said to have survived the fire. Their covers are warped, the leather stiff and cracked. Pages curl like dried leaves. Names blur into ash where water and flame fought for dominion. And yet, what is still legible is stranger than what was lost. Some entries list children twice. Once in the column of residents, alive and accounted for, again in the column of deceased, with the same name written in an unsteady hand. A boy named Peter appears on 2 different papers. One marked as adopted in 1935, another recorded as perished in the fire. A girl named Lila is listed as both present and absent, as though she had been tallied twice in 2 different worlds. The numbers never reconcile. For every page that lists 60 residents, another suggests 80. For every carefully inked name, there is a smudge of one more, half legible, never quite erased. Researchers note a peculiar category that appears and disappears throughout the book. Children with no parents listed, no birth records, no origins at all. They were written into the ledgers as though they had always been there, then crossed out with no explanation. Extras, the margin calls them, extras that never belonged to anyone, and yet demanded to be counted. Community silence. In the months after the fire, a newspaper in town attempted to run a follow-up piece. Reporters interviewed families who claimed their children had been lost without record. One draft even named names, children never mentioned in the coroner's tally. The story never made it to print. The paper issued a short correction instead. The county confirms the official toll of 6. The editor retired the following year and refused to speak about it until his death. Locals discouraged outsiders from digging further. When genealogists came to ask questions decades later, they were met with blank stares, folded arms, and the phrase, "Best let the dead rest." Former staff members vanished from the record as well. Some moved to neighboring towns. Others slipped into obscurity. None granted interviews, though at least one was rumored to have destroyed her own journals before her passing. It was as if Ashwood had been swallowed whole, not just the building, but the story of the children themselves. The first whispers of return, and yet the silence did not hold. By the 1940s, foster families began to share uneasy accounts. Families who had adopted through county programs described strange occurrences. One woman recalled tucking her adopted son into bed, only to find the next morning that a second pillow bore the impression of a small head, though no other child had been in the room. A man photographed his family on the porch in 1945, and when the picture developed, saw a blurred face peering from behind the children. He swore it was no one he knew. Neighbors reported seeing more children in the yard than a family had adopted. "I saw 3, one said, but they told me they had only 2. These early accounts carried a theme, the presence of extra children, brief flickering glimpses, silent watchers, pale outlines in photographs. They never stayed long, never spoke more than a word or two, but their timing was unmistakable. They appeared only in households connected to adoptions, as though following threads left behind in scorched ledgers." The shape of a haunting. If these stories are to be believed, the fire did not end Ashwood. It only dispersed it. The children who perished, those uncounted, unrecorded, seemed to cling to the families who took others in their place, as if refusing to be forgotten. They attached themselves to the rituals of adoption, paperwork, photographs, the first night in a new bed. The orphanage never rebuilt, but the orphans never stopped looking for homes. Ashwood's ruins would grow wild with ivy. The official files would remain sealed. The community would retreat into silence. But in photographs tucked away in family albums, in the memories of bewildered foster parents, in the unease of children who swore they had phantom brothers or sisters, the Ashwood orphans returned, and they still do. The pattern emerges. Ashwood burned in 1936. The ruins blackened, the ledgers smudged, and the county closed the book with 6 neat names. But the story didn't stay closed. In the years that followed, through the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, into the 1970s, a strange rhythm began to reveal itself. Families who had adopted through the county, families who should have had no reason to think about Ashwood at all, started telling similar stories. At first, they were whispered privately, nervous confessions shared over coffee or murmured at church socials. Later, they became a kind of underground folklore among foster networks. The sense that the Ashwood children had not vanished with the fire. They had followed. Adoptive families' accounts. The earliest accounts came from families in the 1940s. One mother described how she took a photograph of her 2 newly adopted daughters standing proudly in their Sunday best. When the picture was developed, 3 girls stood in the frame. The third was blurred, her dress streaked and old-fashioned, her face turned away. The mother burned the photograph, but she never forgot the outline of that stranger. Neighbors confirmed similar sights. I saw 3 children playing in the yard, one woman told a reporter decades later, but they only ever had 2. The pattern continued into the 1950s. Families reported hearing small feet racing down hallways when their adopted child was asleep in bed. Shadows flitted in mirrors. More often, there were simply glimpses, a pale figure at the window, a child leaning against a doorway, gone when approached. By the 1960s, the reports grew bolder. In family portraits, extra faces appeared, sometimes only a blur of hair, sometimes an entire child, staring solemnly at the camera. One man in Baton Rouge kept an album of such photographs, convinced that the Ashwood extras were not imagination, but evidence. The children themselves often noticed what the parents could not. Several foster parents recorded their children speaking casually about siblings who were never adopted. Family friends, they assumed, but invisible friends rarely leave cold spots in the room or the faint smell of smoke behind them. Direct testimonies. The testimonies are where the pattern becomes undeniable. In 1952, a woman adopted a 7-year-old boy. At night, she would tuck him into bed. Sometimes, though, she swore she tucked in 2 boys. She would kiss one forehead, then another, only to return later and find a single child asleep, the other bed perfectly made, untouched and cold. It was as if one of them had never existed, she told a social worker years later, except I can still feel the weight of my hand on his hair. A man in the 1960s spoke of his adopted daughter, who insisted she had a sister still in the house. She told me the girl hid under the stairs, he recalled. She said her sister asked where Matron was, but I had adopted only one child. He eventually boarded up the stairwell, convinced it was a doorway for something he did not understand. By the 1970s, the testimonies were widespread enough that social workers themselves began to trade notes. One described interviewing a girl who claimed her brother had been placed with the family, though no such brother existed on record. Another recalled a child who would not sleep unless an extra bed was made beside her own. Again and again, the same names surfaced, the same questions, and always the same impression. There were more children present than anyone had signed for. Consistent paranormal traits. Across decades, across households that never spoke to each other, the phenomena shared unnerving consistencies. The children appeared solid, at least for a few moments. They could be mistaken for living siblings, until they dissolved into absence. They were almost always silent, watching. When they did speak, their words circled the same themes. Where is Matron? Where are the others? The longing in those questions gnawed at parents who had no answers to give. Their presence was marked by coldness. Parents spoke of icy drafts sweeping through otherwise warm rooms. The air would smell faintly of smoke, as if some ember from 1936 still smoldered nearby. And then there was the timing. The apparitions never appeared at random. They came to families adopting through the county system, families who unwittingly stepped into the paper trail Ashwood had left behind. It was as if the fire-scattered orphans were still bound to those records, following the ink wherever it led. Escalation. By the 1980s, the pattern was no longer just rumor. It was a whispered truth among foster networks, passed down like a warning. "Beware the Ashwood extras," one foster mother said. "They come along for the ride." Families began to expect it. When photographs revealed blurred faces, they nodded grimly. When neighbors counted more children than should have been in the yard, they did not argue. Some even began to set out an extra plate at dinner, a silent acknowledgement of the presence they could not dismiss. In a way, it became a pact of uneasy coexistence. The Ashwood orphans never stayed long, minutes, hours at most, but they made their presence known. Families learned to endure their visits, to treat them as passing storms. But others spoke of escalation, of children standing closer, watching longer, tugging at bedsheets in the night, of voices not just asking for matron, but whispering the names of living children in the house. The county never addressed these stories. Officials continued to insist Ashwood's tragedy had ended in 1936. But by then, the truth had grown larger than any ledger could contain. The orphans had become a haunting that moved with time, attaching itself to generation after generation. They had left the ruins, left the ledgers, and taken up residence in the very idea of adoption. The fire was supposed to erase Ashwood, but instead, it scattered its ghosts into the world. By the late 20th century, the phrase was everywhere among those who whispered, "Ashwood's orphans never left." Documentary evidence and investigation. Every haunting leaves behind its traces, not only in whispers and memories, but in paper, in photographs, in recordings. Ashwood's tragedy is no exception. For every rumor of extra children, there are documents warped by flame, images blurred by more than time, and voices caught on tape that refuse to be silenced. Together, they form the case file, a collage of fragments that suggest the official story was never the whole story. Ledgers and archives. In the county archives, the Ashwood files sit in a sealed cabinet. The folders are stamped with the county seal. Ashwood Fire Inquiry, closed. The word closed is written with a finality that feels defensive, almost desperate, as if the county wanted to nail the lid down on a coffin that would not stay shut. Inside, the ledgers that survived the fire are scorched around the edges. Leather covers are warped, the paper curled and brittle. Many pages are missing entirely, torn out or crumbled into ash. What remains is stranger than absence. Some numbers are legible, written twice, once under residence, again under deceased. Columns of numbers never match from page to page. 60, 70, 80 children, depending on which sheet you read. But in the margins, faint penciled notes. Extras, no parents listed. Uncertain origin. The handwriting shifts, as if multiple hands added corrections in haste, or as if someone had tried, after the fire, to reconstruct what could no longer be trusted. The ledgers feel less like records and more like confessions, half-legible acknowledgments of something too large to count. Photographs. If the ledgers suggest confusion, the photographs suggest something far more unnerving. In the County Museum, there is a black and white adoption photo dated 1942. 5 children are listed by name in the accompanying record, yet the image shows 7 figures, 5 in clear focus, 2 faint and blurred, standing slightly apart. Their faces are indistinct, their clothing outdated even for the time. Archivists have debated whether the blur is a trick of light, a smudge on the lens, or something else entirely. Families kept their own photographs as well. A Polaroid from 1968, unearthed in a box of old belongings, shows a young girl in her new home, smiling shyly on the front steps. Beside her, faint as smoke, is the outline of another child in a suit-streaked dress. The family swore no other child was present when the photo was taken. Other examples crop up through the decades. School portraits with one more child than should have been there. Christmas snapshots with pale faces lingering in the background. Each could be dismissed as a trick of exposure or damaged film. But taken together, they form a mosaic of the uncanny, repeating the same motif, the presence of those who were never meant to be. Oral histories. The stories passed down by families carry the same weight as the documents. In the 1980s, researchers interviewed aging foster parents who had lived through the decades after Ashwood's fire. Their voices quavered on tape as they described phantom additions to their household. One woman remembered hearing laughter upstairs while her adopted son played quietly in the kitchen. When she investigated, she found his bed mussed as if someone had just risen from it. "I swear I had 2 boys for a moment," she said, "and then I had 1 again." Another foster father spoke of a little girl who insisted she shared her toys with a sister no one could see. "I thought it was imagination," he confessed, "but then I heard them both whispering at night." Some of these oral histories survive as audio cassettes, their hiss and crackle broken by faint, unexplained sounds. What might be a second voice on the line? What might be childlike laughter beneath the testimony? Archivists argue over whether these are mechanical glitches. Paranormal investigators point out that glitches rarely call your name. Modern investigations. By the late 20th century, Ashwood had passed from tragedy into legend, a site for ghost hunters and late-night thrill seekers. The foundation still remains, sunken and cracked, ringed by vines. The air carries a charred tang, even after decades of ruin. Paranormal groups who visit often report electromagnetic spikes near the old basement, where the fire is said to have begun. Cameras malfunction, batteries drain. Some investigators describe the sensation of being watched by many eyes at once, though the lot is empty. Digital photographs taken at the ruins frequently distort. In one widely circulated image, a pale hand presses against the frame of a window that no longer exists. In another, faint figures cluster behind the researcher as though posing with them. EVP sessions, practice of capturing voices on digital recorders, produce results too consistent to ignore. Short phrases whispered in the static. "Matron? Count us. Still here." Those who linger too long sometimes carry the haunting home. One investigator described hearing footsteps in her apartment for weeks after visiting. Another reported that her recorder, left in a drawer, switched on by itself and played faint nursery rhymes. The past does not stay buried in Ashwood. It insists on being counted, even now. The case file that refuses closure. Together, the scorched ledgers, the impossible photographs, the trembling voices of foster parents, and the anomalies recorded by modern investigators create a case file that resists closure. The county may have sealed its documents and declared its inquiry finished, but the evidence tells another story, a story of children erased on paper, yet unwilling to vanish. A story of orphans who find ways to step back into the frame, to press their presence into photographs, into tape, into the very circuitry of cameras and recorders. What makes Ashwood unique is not just the fire that destroyed it, but the persistence of those who lived and perhaps died within its walls. They have refused to be forgotten. They have refused to be reduced to 6 neat names in a report. This documentary evidence is not just paperwork and pixels. It is a chorus, growing louder with every decade. It is the children of Ashwood, still trying to be seen. Paranormal overtones. By the time the Ashwood accounts reached the 20th century's close, the stories were no longer just scattered anecdotes. They had cohered into something larger, a mythology of hunger, not the hunger of bellies, though the children of Ashwood knew that all too well. This was the hunger of absence, the desperation of souls never properly named, never properly counted, reaching out to be acknowledged. The hungry souls concept. The simplest way survivors and foster family described the phenomenon was this: they wanted to be noticed. The orphans who were never written into ledgers, never buried beneath gravestones, never even admitted into the coroner's tally, seemed unwilling to vanish. They attached themselves to the living in order to be remembered. At first, they were not malicious. If anything, they seemed tentative. Silent companions lingering at the edges of vision. A boy who appeared in the background of a family photograph, as though hoping to be included. A girl who stood quietly by the window while her foster sibling played with toys. Their presence felt less like a haunting than like an appeal. Some parents described the sensation not as menace, but as pity. They just looked lost, one woman said, like children who wanted to belong to somebody, anybody. It was almost sad. But sadness, when left unanswered for decades, curdles into something sharper. Behavioral patterns. The Ashwood presences followed a strange rhythm, as if their appearances were dictated by ritual. They showed themselves most often in households where an adoption had just occurred. Times of transition. Movements when a new child was entering a family. It was as though the phantom children sensed the shifting of doors and thresholds. Where there was a new beginning, they sought one for themselves. Parents who already had children noticed the effect most strongly. The apparitions seemed to attach to the edges of sibling bonds, slipping into the invisible lines between brother and sister. One foster mother swore that for months she had 3 daughters living under her roof, though paperwork allowed for only 2. Symbolically, the behavior seems pointed. The Ashwood orphans had been promised a home and never given one. They now sought that promise in the lives of others. When one child was chosen, another, unseen, clung to the choice as though it could be shared. In this way, the haunting of Ashwood is not random. It is a haunting tied to the act of adoption itself. The bureaucratic ritual that once betrayed them, becoming the tether by which they return. Psychological effects. For parents, the experience was draining. They described a bone-deep exhaustion, as though caring for one more child than they had. Some reported buying extra food without realizing why, only to find cupboards mysteriously emptier than they remembered. Paranoia crept in. One mother spoke of feeling constantly observed, her every movement tracked by small, watchful eyes. Another confessed she began locking every door in the house at night, though she could never explain who she was keeping out. Children raised in such households often carried stranger memories. Some swore, even into adulthood, that they had grown up with phantom siblings. "I had a brother," one woman insisted. "I can tell you his name, what he liked to eat, what games we played. But my parents tell me I never had one. Psychologists might argue that children are prone to invention. But when invention leaves cold spots in the hallway, when it turns up in photographs, when it tugs at sheets at night, can it still be dismissed as imagination? Escalated manifestations. The longer the stories continued, the darker they became. By the 1970s and 1980s, families began to describe invasive phenomenon. The children no longer remained politely at the edges of photographs. They stepped closer, nearer, sometimes directly behind the living children, faces pale and eyes wide. Mirrors became a common sight of manifestation. A child brushing her hair would glance up to see another girl reflected beside her, soot smudged across her cheeks, only for the image to vanish when she turned her head. Parents, too, reported catching sight of unfamiliar faces hovering over their own shoulders in bathroom mirrors. School photographs grew notorious. Teachers called roll for 20 children, but the class portrait showed 21. An extra face, always solemn, one photographer recalled. He stopped developing Ashwood area photos altogether after one too many unexplained distortions. And then there were the nights. Dozens of families reported being woken by the tugging of bed sheets. Small, persistent hands pulling at the covers until parents awoke with a jolt. It was like a child trying to climb into bed with you, said one foster father, except there was nobody there. Sometimes the voices came with it, small whispers at the edge of sleep. The most common word, matron, sometimes spoken as a plea, sometimes as an accusation, always from mouths no longer living. Interpretive angle. What then are the Ashwood orphans? Are they transitional ghosts, spirits of the dead bound to the earth by unfinished business? Or are they something stranger, echoes of trauma, imprints left by children erased from official memory? Historians argue the haunting is symbolic, a collective guilt born from the county's silence. When you erase a name from a ledger, one archivist remarked, does the soul cling harder, refuse to go until the writing is corrected? Others see something more folkloric, a curse born of neglect, a community's failure given shape. The hungry children of Ashwood became a mirror for the failures of the Depression-era system, repeating themselves through time until acknowledged. Paranormal investigators note that hauntings often cluster around moments of transition. Births, deaths, marriages. Adoption, they argue, is such a moment. In this space where one life is uprooted and another begun, the Ashwood orphans slip through, demanding to be recognized in the same way. And perhaps that is the most chilling interpretation. Not that the orphans want to harm the living, but that they want to join them. That every child welcomed into a new family is shadowed by another, one who was never chosen, who lingers in the threshold forever. The hunger that remains. Whether ghosts or echoes, the Ashwood presences behave with a consistency that suggests more than coincidence. They hunger for names, for belonging, for the simple acknowledgement denied them in life. At first, they are almost gentle, but hunger, when ignored, sharpens. What begins as blurred faces and photographs escalates to whispers in the night, to phantom siblings who refuse to be forgotten. The Ashwood orphans are not poltergeists flinging furniture or wraiths shrieking in the dark. Their haunting is subtler, crueler in its persistence. They ask only to be counted. And when that request is denied, they follow again and again until the living must reckon with them. Because hunger never fades on its own. It only grows. Present day investigation. I went to Ashwood. It's one thing to read the ledgers, the articles, the testimonies. It's another thing to stand where the building once stood, where children screamed through smoke and walls came down. Today, it's not much more than an empty lot. The foundation stones jut out of the earth like broken gravestones. Trees grow where the dormitories once stood, their roots tangled through brick and bone alike. The air is heavy here, even before you unpack a single piece of equipment. I brought everything I could carry: digital recorders, cameras, an EMF meter, a notebook. I thought I'd be ready. I wasn't. The first impressions. Walking the grounds, you notice how quiet it is. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals, just wind moving in low sighs through the trees. The grass is patchy, growing tall and then abruptly dying, as if something beneath the soil refuses to let life settle evenly. I placed my camera on the crumbling edge of what had once been the chapel. I turned on the recorder, spoke my name, the date, the time, all the careful notations of an investigation. But even as I spoke, my voice sounded swallowed, muffled, as though the air itself did not want to carry sound. Phenomenon. The first sign came quickly. I sat near the old laundry room foundation, where the fire supposedly began, and started an EVP session. My questions were simple. Is anyone here? Do you remember that night? Do you want to be heard? When I played the recording back, I caught it. Under my voice, faint but undeniable, the sound of laughter. Not cheerful laughter, thin, distant, childlike. And then, after a pause, a word breathed so softly, I almost missed it. Matron. The EMF meter spiked, flickering red. I felt the hair on my arms lift. I lifted the camera, panning toward the trees. For a moment, the lens caught movement. A small figure darting between trunks. Blurred, impossible to focus on. I followed with my own eyes, but there was nothing there. Only branches shivering in still air. And then came the smell. Smoke. Sharp and acrid, curling around me like a memory. I coughed before I realized there was no fire, no source. The smell was simply there, pressed into the air as if the land itself exhaled it. The immersive encounter. It was near dusk when I took out the scorched adoption ledger. I had been given access to a single surviving volume, its spike blackened, its pages warped. The archivist had warned me not to read from it in the field, but I had to try. Kneeling among the weeds, I opened the book and read aloud the names still legible. Peter, Lila, Samuel. My voice trembled, the syllables dry on my tongue. The reaction was immediate. A cold rush of wind slammed through the ruins, bending tree branches sideways. My recorder hissed, filling with static, and layered over that static came voices. Not one, not two, but dozens, overlapping, tumbling into each other like waves. You forgot us, the phrase repeated again and again. Child voices tangled in a chorus, some angry, some pleading, all insistent. I clutched the ledger tighter, and for a heartbeat, I swore I felt hands tugging at the edges of the paper, small hands trying to hold on. I snapped the book shut, the voices cut off, the wind stilled, but the silence that followed was worse, a silence that watched. Psychological fallout. I left the ruins as the sun bled out behind the trees, but Ashwood didn't leave me. That night I dreamed of children following me home. I saw them standing at the end of my hallway, pale and soot-streaked, their outlines blurred like old photographs. They didn't speak in the dream. They only stared, their silence pressing against me until I woke, gasping. The strangeness continued even in waking hours. The recorder I'd carried to Ashwood tapped against itself when I left it on my desk, as if tiny fingers were drumming its casing. Once I found it switched on, though I had turned it off. The playback was nothing but faint breathing. I can tell myself these are coincidences, that the mind, once seated with dread, grows its own phantoms. A part of me knows that once you call a name aloud from the Ashwood ledger, you don't walk away untouched. A presence that endures. Standing in those ruins, it was impossible not to feel it. The weight of those uncounted children. The laughter caught on tape. The blurred figure in the trees. The smoke with no fire. The voices pleading, "You forgot us." The county declared the Ashwood fire finished in 1936, but the land tells another story. The ruins tell another story, and so do the children, who are still there, still waiting, still hungry to be remembered. Theories and reflections. I've had time to sit with what I found at Ashwood. Time hasn't made it clearer. If anything, the questions multiply. There are explanations, mundane, bureaucratic, clinical. And then there are the others, the ones that whisper in the dark, the ones that follow me home. Possible explanations. The first explanation is the simplest, and perhaps the most damning. A bureaucratic cover-up. Counties in the 1930s were ill-equipped to deal with scandal, especially one involving children. Admitting to dozens of deaths would mean lawsuits, inquiries, resignations. Far easier to name 6. Bury them with ceremony and quietly lose track of the rest. If that's the case, then Ashwood's extra children are simply the unnamed dead. Their absence on paper forced them into presence in the world, phantoms born of red tape and denial. The second theory is darker still. Mass unmarked graves. Stories persist of wagons leaving the ruins at night, of soil disturbed in the orchard behind the home. The idea that more bodies were buried quickly, without coffins, without markers, is not far-fetched. If those graves exist, they have never been exhumed, and perhaps that silence is exactly what fuels the haunting. Children crying out until someone digs them up. Then there is the notion of collective trauma birthing a psychic imprint. A tragedy so large, so violently denied, can echo for decades. The laughter in the static, the faces in photographs. Maybe they are not souls at all, but the land itself replaying its grief like a broken record, like smoke trapped in the air. And finally, the interpretation most often whispered by foster families, that orphan spirits actively attach themselves to adoption, that the act of bringing one child home opens the door for others to slip through, those who never had the chance. Adoption as ritual, paperwork as summoning, a crib filled not just by the chosen child, but a shadow beside them. The guilt of neglect. Whatever the explanation, the shape of the haunting feels like an accusation. The community chose to erase the Ashwood orphans, chose silence over truth, erasure over reckoning, and in that choice something was created. The ghost children of Ashwood are more than just spirits. They are memory itself given form. Memory that refuses to stay buried. They are what happens when a town decides not to count its children, when it pretends the dead were fewer than they were. Every blurred photograph, every whisper on tape, every small face glimpsed in the corner of the eye, each one is the past demanding to be recognized. The orphans are not haunting families. They are haunting history, reminding us that forgetting is never free. Open-ended closure. When I stand among the ruins, ledger in hand, I heard them. You forgot us. The chorus rings louder in my head than any official record ever could. So I ask myself, if only 6 died, why do so many still seek a bed? Why do so many still climb into photographs, into hallways, into dreams? Maybe the Ashwood orphans don't want vengeance. Maybe they don't want fear. Maybe they only want what was always promised but never given. A family to keep them. And perhaps that's the cruelest part of all. Closure. The vanishing children. A week after my visit, a package arrived in the mail. A listener, who had heard I was investigating Ashwood, sent me a family photograph taken last year. A bright, ordinary scene. 2 smiling children on a porch, their parents behind them. And then at the edge of the frame, a face. Faint, blurred, half hidden in shadow. A child not listed in the caption. A child no one remembers being there. I set the photo down, unsettled. That night my recorder clicked on by itself. From the speaker came a whisper, thin and urgent, like breath through smoke. Don't forget me. Every family who opens their home opens a door, and sometimes the ones who were left behind still come through. Ashwood is gone. Its walls are rubble, its ledgers charred, its children scattered. But the story isn't finished. Not while their faces keep surfacing. Not while their voices still ask for matron. Not while photographs keep insisting that more children stand in the frame than were ever adopted. Some cases end with answers. This one ends with smoke, silence, and the sense that someone is still waiting to be counted. If you've ever woken to the sound of small footsteps, if you've ever seen an extra face in the photograph, one that shouldn't be there, then you already know Ashwood is not finished. You've been listening to Trinity Holmes, Paranormal Investigator. Subscribe for more stories that won't stay buried. We open a new file every week, and if the lights flicker tonight, remember, they're only trying to be seen.